Okay, well, the Sierra Club is the largest, oldest grassroots conservation group in the United States. We started in 1892, and we've been operating for 118 years, and we've evolved over time. It started as a small California hiking club, primarily interested in exploring the Sierra Nevada of California. It's now national and has a branch in Canada. And we've got 1.3 million members and supporters, and we work on the whole broad array of environmental issues, but our primary focus is on climate change. Prior to 1970, the Sierra Club was fighting in order to protect the natural environment. For example, we tried to, and successfully, stopped hydroelectric dams from being built in the Grand Canyon. But we were primarily doing that on our own, and there weren't a lot of other citizen advocacy groups working on the environment. There really wasn't a modern environmental movement, and the Sierra Club was the main advocacy group that was out there. But in the 1960s, there was a lot of social unrest that occurred. At that time, in the United States, there was segregation that took place, and Afro-Americans and whites in the south of the United States were segregated. They had separate drinking fountains and restrooms. Black people couldn't ride in the front of the bus. They couldn't eat at lunch counters. And this was very wrong and an injustice. And so there started to be citizen protests and sit-ins and rallies, and ultimately enough mobilization took place through the civil rights movement, primarily nonviolent, that they were able to pass the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and remove that particular injustice. After that, it kind of transformed into this huge anti-war movement over the Vietnam War. And again, people were using sit-ins, and they started a new tactic called a teach-in. And the teach-in was basically to go onto campuses, primarily universities, and teach about what was going on with the Vietnam War, because it was felt that the U.S. government at that time wasn't telling the full story, and at the same time the students at the university were being conscripted. We had a draft, and so students didn't like the choice of saying, well, pick up a gun and go fight in Vietnam, when they didn't necessarily believe in the cause. So there was a huge anti-war movement that was going on. But at the exact same time, when all this social unrest was happening and people were starting to exert political muscle in order to try to change public policy, there was an environmental crisis that was becoming more and more evident on the American landscape. And there were several big key events that occurred in the late 1960s that basically catapulted the environmental issue into the front of the American consciousness. One that is widely recognized with having a major impact and causing the first Earth Day to come about was there was a river in Ohio that caught fire. It was called the Cuyahoga River. And there was so much petroleum pollution that was spilling into the river that it created a big oil slick, and the entire river caught fire. And images of that showed up in all the major publications. So Time magazine had big photos of the Cuyahoga River burning, and people said, what is wrong with our society and our country when an entire river can catch fire? Similarly, one of the Great Lakes, Lake Erie, which is one of the largest bodies of fresh water in the world, got so polluted that all the fish started dying in it, and they started washing up on the beaches, and Lake Erie was declared dead biologically. And again, people said, you know, this isn't right. This is America. We shouldn't be having these kinds of problems taking place. Another major thing that happened is birds started dying all around the country, and they failed to reproduce anymore. So the bald eagle, which is the national symbol of the United States, you find it on our currency, on our dollar bills and on our quarters, it stopped having young in the 1960s because it was so contaminated with the pesticide DDT that it couldn't produce eggshells that were thick enough so that when it sat on the eggs in the nest, they actually cracked the eggs and all the young died. So there weren't any young eagles being born anywhere in the lower 48 states of the United States. And that was tragic. There was a book that was written at the time by a Sierra Club member named Rachel Carson, and it was called Silent Spring. And the idea behind Silent Spring was that if we don't take care of all these pesticides and herbicides that are killing the wildlife, and particularly the birds, then we will experience a spring where there won't be the sounds of spring anymore. So there won't be frogs and insects and bird song, and instead it'll just be quiet because the wildlife will all be stilled. And many people again attribute that particular book to, the fact that Earth Day suddenly, came onto the landscape. Well, I like to say that great progress has been made, but there is much, much more to do, and it's no time to be complacent. When the Clean Air Act passed, there was a promise in the Clean Air Act that every American had a right to breathe clean air, and we were going to clean up all the polluted cities. But in fact, now here it is, 40 years after the Clean Air Act passed, and people are still living in polluted cities. There's maybe 30 million people that at least part of the year the air is unfit to breathe and they can't really go out. I mean, there's many cities that have been cleaned up, but there's many that are still contaminated. Similarly, when the Clean Water Act passed, there was a promise to the American people that within 10 years, all the rivers and streams and lakes in the United States would become drinkable, swimmable, and fishable. But now, 40 years later, 2/3 have been cleaned up. We don't have rivers catching fire anymore. The Cuyahoga is cleaner than it has been in 100 years, but there's still 1/3 of the rivers in the United States that don't meet the clean water standards. And unfortunately, most of the areas that don't meet clean air standards, that don't meet clean water standards, where we still have toxic waste dumps that are contaminating neighborhoods, happen to be the poorest neighborhoods in the United States. So they're the ones where people of color and low-income people live. And they got kind of left behind when the environmental movement was charging forward and promising that all these great things were going to happen. So this is no time to stop. And just because affluent people feel that they no longer have to worry about clean air and clean water or whether or not their tap water has arsenic in it, there's still many other people every day that are living with pollution. And so it's very important that we keep the battle going until both in the United States and all around the world, we have solved the environmental problem. The other key thing, and why I think we're very behind the times, where we need to do more and recommit ourselves, is because when the first Earth Day passed, nobody thought that carbon dioxide was a serious pollutant that we had to worry about. Carbon dioxide is just what you breathe out with every breath. What's dangerous about that? But in fact, we now know that carbon dioxide leads to global warming. And between 1970, the first Earth Day, and today, 2010, we've doubled the concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And as a result, we've now exceeded the threshold that the Earth can actually sustain in order to protect life on Earth. The history of environmental progress in the United States and the history of progress around the world has largely been because citizens have stood up and said, we insist as a basic human right that we have clean air, that we have clean water, that we have a safe environment, that we are protecting our fellow species on the planet, and now that we are addressing climate change. And the way that it needs to change is basically for more people to engage in the political process and to hold their elected officials accountable. President Obama wants to be able to go to Cancun and negotiate a tough climate treaty. His science advisors tell him that he's got to do it, that the future of the United States and the future of the world and the future of human civilization depends upon getting a strong climate change agreement. So he wants to do that, but he doesn't have the political cards to deal with it because he can't get 60 votes in the US Senate in order to be able to negotiate a strong treaty, bring it back to the United States, and get it ratified.